Hey, Angela and Rebecca, thanks so much for that presentation. You folks can unmute so we can go through some of the questions that people have, and thank you everyone for your live chat and your questions that you had there. So we're going to start with some more technical kinds of questions. We had some questions about, does HIFIS collect the kind of information that you need for the role in the CHR? And are those reports available now? How does that work?
Yes, so obviously we've made changes to the database with version 59. And as noted during the presentation, we are also writing a specific report on the CHR that will be available shortly through HIFIS. In terms of the specifics, I'm going to turn over to Angela to maybe speak to some of that, and also the piece about the role reporting as well.
Thanks, Rebecca. So yes, version 59 was an essential update to make the community homelessness report work. So we added in things like being able to track inactivity. So that's the client state. We also expanded the understanding of housing status. So having HIFIS have a new feature where it can identify who is homeless, who is housed, who is transitional, and there is an option for unknown where housing history data is not available at the current moment. So those kinds of features, as well as being able to calculate chronic homelessness, we've made enhancements. So version 59 is required in order for the CHR report to work. We will be offering training on that report. It's in its final testing. And so we look for feedback on that, of course, but we are testing it with communities already in the 59 platform. In terms of the role, so that's the annual client level detail that could be generated from HIFIS. It is deliverable of Reaching Home as well as the community homelessness report. The community homelessness report is aggregate level data. It's a bit different, where the role is only data for clients that have been funded or that have been served through a program funded through Reaching Home. So it's that Reaching Home snapshot of clients. We are also writing a HIFIS report specifically to be able to pull out the client level details. I know that's something communities have asked for some time. So if there are future changes to the database, those would be in version 60 or beyond that point. So you can look for some training. May require some adjustments, but certainly the CHR, those changes have already been made to the database to make the report.
That's great. Thanks, Angela and Rebecca. So we have a question around, is there any veteran information included in the CHR and the outcome reporting? Is this connected at all to Veteran Affairs Canada?
That's a really, really good question. And the community homelessness report is really specific to the Reaching Home program. That being said, it does capture all of those individuals who are experiencing homelessness. So all of the different subpopulations, which would include veterans experiencing homelessness. Of course, each department has their own reporting requirements, and the community homelessness report is specifically for Reaching Home. But we do coordinate as much as possible in that respect. And Angela, I don't know if you have anything you would like to add in terms of specifics.
Yeah, the only thing I would say would be that there is an opportunity just to make sure that there's alignment on the data that gets submitted just at the local level to make sure that there's good engagement with veterans serving organizations, aligning language on intake forms. There's a lot of good work that is happening where we want to make sure again that population, so veterans experiencing homelessness, are included in the community homelessness report, and communities have the option to identify that as a specific outcome population. So in the CHR, you have optional additional outcomes. You could, as a community, identify veterans and then set some targets for reduction of homelessness for that specific population. We welcome that, and any notes that you'd like to share, even in your highlights for that year, if that's something that your community has focused on. So great idea. And yeah, thanks for the question.
That's great. And this question probably leads into that, and you may have mentioned, but just to reiterate, like in terms of breakdown of homelessness, like what are the breakdowns that are required versus the ones that are optional in the CHR?
Yes, for sure. So the CHR has 3 mandatory groups that communities within the designated communities and territorial homelessness stream would have to report on. Those include overall homelessness, chronic homelessness, and Indigenous homelessness specifically. Everything else is optional, but as Angela mentioned quickly, communities can add subpopulation groups within the CHR, including youth, including veterans, as we alluded to prior in the previous question. Angela, do you have anything to add on that specific one?
I would just say that in the CHR reference guide, so we have an e-course available on the Homes Hub that we mentioned in the presentation. There are some population groups that are, suggested. So again, youth, veterans, women, and we do identify an option to talk about families or just single households. So there's lots of flexibility. Those 3 mandatory populations help to give us some consistency in reporting across the country. But I really welcome the flexibility for communities to add in those additional population groups to make it their own and to, again, focus their reduction targets for what makes sense based on their list and who is showing up and needing to be served in the system. So really welcome communities to tailor the outcome data for what makes sense for them based on their list and what it's showing them, which could change over time.
Great, thanks, Angela. So we have a question here, and I'm doing a bunch of technical questions, and then I think we'll get into some governance and some other questions. If your community uses a different HMIS than HIFIS, do you still need to do the CHR through HIFIS?
That's a really interesting question. This one is a bit more in Angela's field, so I'll let her answer that one.
So we do allow communities that had a pre-existing HMIS prior to the program being launched in April of 2019. So that's actually one of the questions in the community homelessness report, which says, is HIFIS the system that your community uses? And if not, it would be because, again, it was a pre-existing equivalent system. So for those communities, we would allow the flexibility for them to use the HMIS of their choice. And in terms of reporting for the CHR, there is actually no requirement that HIFIS is used. So for example, some communities might use an Excel template for their list. And now there's a question specific about that, which we can get to. But there's no requirement that the data source, how it's managed, has to come from HIFIS. There is, again, a requirement on the HMIS in the system for reaching home-funded communities. But we would say that likely, as you get a larger population group and lots of those ins and outs, and again, it's a very dynamic, the list is very dynamic, in order to be able to probably get annualized data unduplicated, an HMIS is likely required. Again, that would be dependent on probably the size of the list and the dynamicness of it, how often it changes. But we would recognize that communities likely will need some form of an HMIS to track this data with greater reliability.
Thank you. A couple of questions about non-reaching home communities. So is HIFIS available to non-reaching home designated communities? And is there opportunities? How do you become a reaching home designated community? That one's a little out of scope, but I thought the two might go together okay.
Yes, no, really, really good questions. And there was an application process to be identified as a reaching home community. We also more recently, in terms of the Reaching Home program, extended the designated community stream to 6 additional communities. That was also done through an open and transparent process, so communities could apply to become a reaching home community. It will be determined as to what would be available in the future, but there is a clear, open, and transparent process. It is something that we would communicate through a Reaching Home newsletter should there be a subsequent process in the future, and openness to apply. So definitely stay tuned. And if you don't have access to the newsletter, we'd be happy to share the link for folks to subscribe. Angela, do you want to speak about the HIFIS component?
Yeah. So we do have a few communities across Canada that are not reaching home designated communities that do use HIFIS. There is a process in place. And maybe what we can do somehow, it's really, if you go on HIFIS, like it's the HIFIS client services. You would send an email to them They have a tool that's basically a HAITI readiness checklist, or sort of a tool that communities would complete just to give us some more information about the way that the community is organized. The intention for the tool is to support coordinated access. And so HAITI 4 is the platform that's being rolled out. We used to have HAITI 3. That's not so much really the focus of our work now. It's really around HAITI 4. And again, it's sort of, somebody once said to me, you know, HAITI 4, it's great, you know, bring your friends. It's the idea of really having a network community sort of service delivery network through HAITI. So we would probably prefer that communities, it's not so much the standalone operator level database, but rather supporting coordinated access and some of the work through the Reaching Home program, those kinds of things. But definitely reach out to our HAITI client support desk, and they can get you started and put you in the right direction for next steps.
And maybe if I can add just one small thing as well, there is going to be a HIFIS Mythbuster session this afternoon. So I would definitely encourage those of you who are interested in learning more about HIFIS and the supports available on that front to attend. We also have a Reaching Home Q&A session through the Reaching Home Lounge during one of the breaks this afternoon. And we will also be available to respond to coordinated access specific questions as well as HIFIS specific questions. So just two little plugs here if folks have additional questions following this session.
Those are great prompts, Rebecca. I was also going to mention, so that HIFIS Mythbuster session is the CA2 that is happening in the afternoon called Technological Systems. So that's how you'll get into that HIFIS Mythbusters. All right, we had a question from Chris just about the difficult time calculating the numbers for how many unduplicated people experiencing homelessness, because their Excel document is live and isn't necessarily capturing historical data. So there may be some ways to sort and filter. I'm going to put that back out to the group. If anyone wants to chat in how they handled that in their community, that would be great to share. But I also just wonder if you found any, as people were answering the CHR, yeah, some of, like, if that came up at all. And also, were people able to report outcomes on their CHR? Like, did you have a percentage that were doing that already?
Sure. So I think that it will be a bit of a two-part answer there. Outcome data was not required. So it really depends on a community's progress with their list. So this particular annual reporting session, the outcome piece was not a requirement. I think, Angela, if you want to maybe speak a bit more to that aspect and also about some of the potential nuances around that, that would be really helpful.
Yeah, no problem. So I think similar to the question before around, is HIFIS the tool that has to be used for CHR generating the report? We would recognize that an HMIS has some advantages because, again, it can kind of go back in time. So you can, the CHR report is actually going to give communities the flexibility to set the time for the beginning and the end of the reporting cycle that makes sense for them. So it does allow for that, again, going back retroactively and being able to pick out, one period of time, one day of homelessness within the reporting period. That's different than many communities might be positioned to do with the by name list, say, for example, in Excel. And so we did offer for this year, given the fact that it's very new, we did offer communities to give us 1 month snapshot of data, say, for example, as they had released to Built for Zero for March of either the current fiscal or the previous fiscal for those 2 reporting periods. So that was an option, again, recognizing that many communities are still transitioning to sort of HMIS or HIFIS. So that was one thing. In terms of how many communities have reported on outcomes, I can say some have. We definitely have seen that. And it's kind of that progressive reporting tool. So again, we're really guiding communities around the minimum requirements and getting sort of in a position where they're able to collect and generate and share community level data. And then the outcomes will follow from that after you have a comprehensive list for 1 year. So again, those are sort of those prerequisites that can take some time, and which is why we weren't saying that for sure all communities had to have outcome data in that first year. We know some do, for sure. And again, we did give that flexibility for that 1 month snapshot if communities were really wanting to share their outcome data, but weren't able to, as Chris was saying, get that annualized, unduplicated per down part yet.
Yeah, it is a new process, and we know that for the first year, we may not be able to get to that level of information and data, but the intent is for it to be a progressive reporting tool. And so as we complete this reporting process over the course of the next few years, we will start seeing some larger outcomes-based data emerge.
Thank you. I can see we're going to have more questions than we're going to have time for. So I'll ask a couple of quick ones, and then we'll wrap up, and I'll let folks know what the next steps are. And we can also continue to answer these questions like offline back in the chat. So if there were missed questions, there's an opportunity for presenters to go back in and do that. But we did have a question about what's transitional, what's housed, what's homeless. Like, where can people find these definitions?
That's a really good question. And Angela, who's my technical expert, will go into that answer specifically. Thanks.
Yeah, so we have a community homelessness report reference guide that has all of the sort of the questions defined in there. And so we have defined, homeless, housed, transitional, unknown there. I would also say that these are tied directly to HAITI in the way that HAITI defines or has those drop-down options, because as we were developing the CHR, we wanted to make sure that the coding was available in the back end. So the version 59 reference guide is another really helpful tool as you're wanting to understand the whole housing continuum and how we sort of bundle things into those pieces. The unknown, I would say, is simply that there is no data available for housing type for 1 or more days. So that was given as a flexible option, recognizing that data is not always complete, and we want communities to be able to see that in their results to be able to set some improvement cycles on completeness of their housing history.
Great, thanks, Angela. So we had a question about, like, there's not enough housing in community. We're having trouble, like, we're trying to coordinate processes, but we're finding there's not enough housing. And I'm curious how you would respond to that. And also, like, does anything get highlighted in the CHR around that at all?
That's a really interesting question. I think it is obviously an issue that we see across the country in terms of housing supports being required, but also the physical bricks and mortar, the actual houses for folks. So that being said, we do work very closely with our colleagues in CMHC, the Canadian Mortgage Housing Corporation. We know that there are, obviously they go hand in hand when it comes to tackling homelessness. So that definitely is ongoing work. In terms of the immediate, however, I don't think there is a fast-paced solution. We are looking into that issue. We do have a new minister that has a different portfolio. So Minister Hussein, who used to also support housing and homelessness, is now Minister of Housing, Diversity and Inclusion. So very focused on this particular issue, and we hope that we can advance further on that front. I don't know if Angela, you had any addition to provide?
I would echo that it is a challenge. I would echo the importance of as we all know, housing and homelessness, it's like always a housing issue, not necessarily only a housing issue. I would say that the tools we're providing through the CHR are really for communities to spur those important conversations of making sure that you have a list that is comprehensive. You're supporting that community level discussion. You're setting those outcomes based on what the community would like to focus on, recognizing that if everything is a priority, nothing's a priority. We really recognize that the demands are huge. The conversations can be, ongoing. And so how do we focus? How do we know what is working and try to, build off of those strategies, have the conversations, make sure there's good partnerships across sectors, and where we do have vacancies, how do we make sure that we match up with the right people at the right time? And so It's not a negation of the importance of building housing and making sure we have more resources. It's really meant to support that effective use of the resources that exist and support the conversations laterally, up, down, everywhere, to say, you know, this is important, this is the unmet need, this is what we're focused on, and this is what, you know, this is how we're kind of going to come forward with a united message.
Thanks. That was very nicely said. And, you know, we always say we may not have enough housing to finish, but we have enough to get started. And so we can start, we can coordinate, we can improve, we can identify those gaps and work to fill those gaps. So great question to end off on. There were other questions related to consent and recruitment to your cab and other things. And hopefully between us, we can do some offline answering of those questions. So people should check back to see if those questions got answered. But we are at time. And thank you very much to Angela and Rebecca for pulling that presentation together and answering all those questions. I will let folks know what is coming up next.
Perfect. And it was a pleasure for us to participate, Marie. Thank you so much to CAH for the invitation. And we hope that the presentation was useful, and we're happy to continue to answer questions via the chat.
Wonderful. Thank you. Yes. And thank you to our audience for attending this session and for all of your great questions and chats. I do want to remind you to complete the session evaluation, which is located under the video player beside the discussion tab, and that Dr. Andrew Bosery's keynote presentation will begin in about 15 minutes at 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time. And that's it. Thanks again. And we'll see everyone later. Bye now.
Thank you. Bye for now.